What is going on, guys? My name is Bucky Roberts and welcome to your very first tutorial in biology. Now, in this video series, what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys about many different topics concerning biology. For example, I want to talk to you guys about DNA and genetics and cells and bacteria and life and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. But since this is the very first video, I think what we should do in this video is just stick with the very basics. And the first thing I want to do is talk to you guys about what is biology? So let's go ahead and answer that question, and the definition of biology is this: the study of life and living organisms. Alright, that makes sense up to a certain point, up until organisms, because you may have heard of organisms before, and you may have your own definition, but the scientific definition of an organism is a living thing. Well, that's easy. We know what living things are. I'm a living thing. Plants, grass is a living thing. My puppy, named Old Dan, cutest puppy ever, by the way, is a living thing. But whenever we talk about living things, believe it or not, things get kind of complicated, because then you have to ask yourself, what is life? Well, of course, if you ask your grandma or your best friend, or even if you ask a philosopher, what is life? Everyone is going to give you kind of a different definition of their outlook on life. However, whenever scientists and biologists were first deciding, you know what is life? That's the problem that they had. Everyone had their own separate definition of life itself. So what they needed to do before biology was even invented, which is of course the study of life, is scientists needed to agree on the definition of life.
So when we talk about the polar regions, just to clarify exactly what we mean, we have first of all the Arctic at the top of the Earth and the Antarctic at the bottom. So the Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Now surprisingly, it's not after the polar bears that live in the Arctic, but it's after the Little and Great Bear constellations that can be seen in the sky. Now the Greeks also hypothesized that there would be an anti-Arctic, which is how we get the name Antarctica. But of course it wasn't discovered until much later on. Now these regions are opposite in many ways other than just their names and their location on the globe. So if we look at the Arctic first of all, the Arctic is actually ocean surrounded by land. So we can see here, this is the UK down here, and this is kind of Russia, and then America and Canada around here. So there is a bit of land covered in ice in the Arctic, which is Greenland here. But mostly all this area here, surprisingly, a lot of people don't realise that this isn't actually land. The North Pole isn't on land, it's just one big ocean.
Welcome to today's lesson. We are continuing with our study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. So for instance, a good way to think about taxonomy is the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we first start off by addressing it to the nation they're in. By default, we usually assume that's America, but it doesn't have to be. It could be England or Costa Rica or Spain. You put their nation or their kingdom. Then within that kingdom, you address it to a slightly more specific level, their state. So for instance, South Carolina would be the same as a phylum. Then within that state, you would address it to their city, and then to their street number, the street they live on. Then you would address it to, say, their apartment complex, and within that complex, you'd address it by their last name to their family, and then finally their first name to the specific person you want to get it to. And in that way, we're able to weed out all the 400 million people we don't want to send our letter to in America and pinpoint the exact person we want the letter to reach. And in the same way, scientists use a taxonomy chart to pinpoint a living creature, an organism, and how it relates to everything else in the world.
Turner, not surprisingly, painted one of the earliest pictures of London's fog in the 1835 painting The Thames Above Waterloo Bridge. Turner, as a true-born Londoner, is advertising his familiarity with London's air problem by putting smoke and atmospheric pollution at its centre. And as you can see in here, the bridge is the central element, which is a theme that's later taken up by Monet. And it's partly obscured by the steam and smoke which rises from both sides of the river. Here we see a shot tower, I think you can just about see it, which was constructed in 1826. Do you know what shot towers are? They produce shot for guns, ammunition, and they were very smoky, one of the more smoky industries. But it's barely visible, as you can see, as are the various industries on the Lambeth side of the river. On this side, there's a steamship about to dock or preparing to leave. It's black smoke thrusting up to join the kind of swirling arc of smoke there. William Rodner sees this painting as a potent essay on the energy and complexity of modern polluted urbanism. Smoke, I think, here represents a flourishing economy which brings employment and food on tables, but also the dirt and pollution associated with its fumes. All seems to be tainted by a sulphurous yellow, even the black plumes of smoke.
Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it and what does it mean? When at UCL Center for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to assess the environment at another historic library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books. And we were also asked, for the first time really, I was actually quite taken aback by the brief, we were asked, whatever you do, please preserve the smell. It's so important to our audience. It's so important how people perceive the library. So that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company, because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight, obviously, to interact with the environment. But on the second place, we see that smell is also very, very important. It is also a very, very interesting sense. I'll talk a bit about that later.
I have said before that you can't have a civilization that doesn't have art. When we think about the great civilizations historically, all of them had great production of culture and art, because a society has to be able to observe itself. And the sophistication of the great civilizations were their ability to look at themselves. And what allows a society to do that are the producers of art and culture. It would mirror back to the core of the society exactly what is being produced at that moment, how people are thinking of themselves, and how individuals are relating to the social structure at that time. Art is the vehicle through which we understand that. Were you to take away art, what would be that mirror? How would we see what we are about? How would we understand what was going on in Paris at the time of the Impressionists, when people were learning to see in a completely different way. Cinematography, all of these things are just emerging, and here are people looking at the world in a very different way, which was considered so radical.
So, what do we mean by well-being? Health, happiness, a sense of achievement and contentment, a state of mind and body where people can thrive. Well-being is not something that is purely limited to people who are facing extraordinary challenges in their lifestyle, health, or personal circumstances. Everybody here has a level of well-being. Music so often forms an intuitive part of our well-being management. Music to pick us up, music to calm us down, music to heal our sorrows. Our aim, through research, is to move from this level of intuitive application of music through to informed use in our communities, to take the next step in the understanding of the power of music in human life. Music already works for us on so many levels, whether it's soothing and teaching our infants, bringing people and communities together, adding spirit to our work and personal endeavours. But there is no reason to stop here. We can and we should go further.
The Skoog is a new universally accessible musical instrument. It's designed for use by children or adults with special needs, or in fact for use by anyone. It's soft, it's easy to play, it's robust, and it can be customised to suit anyone's abilities. The Skoog helps children with special needs by allowing them to get involved in making music themselves. It's an instrument that they can play and they can take ownership of and start creating their own sounds and music. Traditionally, instruments are the shape and size and made of the materials they are because of the sound that they need to make. If you want something to sound like a plucked string, you need a string and it needs to be under tension. Whereas with the Skoog, because it's a mixture of software and a sensor, then the computer can handle making the sound, and so we can design an object that's designed to be touched and designed to be played with. In developing the Skoog and actually working with kids in the schools and in the classroom, it's really helped us make the Skoog something that's usable by the children themselves. They've informed us massively on how it needs to work, and they've given their opinion on colours and design, and just the feedback that they've given to us has been just marvellous. It's just so enriching, and it's really inspiring to actually work with these kids, particularly when you can provide them with an ability to start playing their own music as opposed to just taking part through listening and listening to other musicians and really learning from them.
But we can really thank the great exhibition of 1851 for giving us the world's premier taxi service. For it was going to this exhibition, this fabulous exhibition of inventions from all around the four corners of the empire, that the visitors were appalled, dismayed and vexed by their journeys to this exhibition, because the cabbies of the day in their horse-drawn carts were absolutely terrible, could not find their way to this exhibition. And so, at great public outcry, the London authorities set up the Public Carriage Office, which is an organisation that still exists, and you can take a short walk to Penton Street up the road. And this Public Carriage Office took on the responsibility of licensing all major taxi drivers in London. All taxi drivers from 1851 onwards had to pass what is now known as the London Knowledge, this phenomenal knowledge of London. What is the London Knowledge? It's the ability to remember the 25,000 streets, how they're all interconnected, and know all the main arterial roads in and out of London. Cabbies need to know all this, plus 1,000 points of specific interest, cafes, bars, public offices. They need to know them all as part of their training.
When this dog approaches some food, another dog's playful snarls are played back. The dog seems curious, but the sound doesn't stop it from taking the bone. Here, a dog hears the growls of a dog being approached by a stranger. But these don't deter it from grabbing the bone either. In another scenario, the sound of a dog protecting its food is played back. This time, the dog backs off. These experiments suggest that dogs can distinguish between different types of growls.
When you think of a leader, you may think of an individual who is, above all, bold. But a new study of fish called sticklebacks shows that shy individuals actually prefer to follow fish that are similarly timid. Researchers had trios of sticklebacks with known personalities play follow the leader. The fish were placed in a tank that had some plastic plants at one end and some food hidden at the other. In some of the groups, a bold fish and a shy fish acted as leaders, while another shy fish followed. And in other groups, it was a bold fish that did the following. The researchers recorded whether the follower sallied forth more frequently with the fish that was behaviorally similar or the one that was different. What they found is that shy fish were more likely to emerge from under cover when an equally wary fellow was already out there. Bold follower fish did not seem to care as much which leader they followed. Of course, no matter which fish a stickleback chose to stick with, the bold fish did lead more joint expeditions over the course of the experiment than their more retiring friends. That's because the bold fish initiated more trips, regardless of who might be tailing them. The findings are in the journal Biology Letters. The researchers write that when offered a choice of leaders, sticklebacks prefer to follow individuals whose personality matches their own. But bolder individuals may, nevertheless, be able to impose their leadership, even among shy followers, simply through greater effort. We may soon see if such tendencies also hold true in humans when Americans decide who they'll follow in November. Unless, of course, something fishy happens.
I'm just going to take on where Stafford left off. And the hormone I want to talk to you about is called melatonin. And it's synthesized in the pineal gland, which is a very small, it's the size of a pea in your brain. Descartes called it the seat of the soul, and it is where melatonin is made. Is this working? And it has a rhythm as well. And in a sense, it's the opposite of cortisol. It peaks at night. We call it the darkness hormone. In every species that we've studied, melatonin occurs at night. And it's a hormone that prepares you for the things that your species does at night. So, of course, in humans, we sleep. But animals like rodents, they're awake. So it's a hormone that is related to darkness behavior.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
A wind turbine is a device that will convert wind into mechanical movement, which we can use to power a water pump or electricity generator. Now, the power that a turbine creates is obviously dependent on the wind speed. It's also dependent obviously on the number of sails, the area of the sails, and the angle that the sails makes to the wind. So if you can imagine, if the turbine blades are flat onto the wind is just going to sort of bend it. But if they're at a slight angle, when the wind hits it, it's going to turn the blades, and we can use that for powering things. Now, we're going to have a go at making some very, very simple paper windmills, the sort of things that you can make from the bits and pieces lying around at home, and use that to drive a very small generator to power electronic devices.
I think with our linguistic training, we also get all this invisible training to be authorities, to be the people who know. It is part of that process that you come out as a world authority on your chosen subject. But when we move into working with communities, we have to recognise that the communities have to be the authority in their language. And actually, a woman in the class I'm teaching at Sydney at the moment, a Korean woman, expressed this very nicely, although she was talking about something else. She was distinguishing expertise from authority. And certainly linguists, because of our training, we do have expertise in certain very narrow areas of language, but we don't have the authority over what to do with that knowledge or what to do with other knowledge that the community produces. And I guess for me, the bottom line is languages are lost because of the dominance of one people over another. And that's not rocket science. It's not hard to work that out. But then what that means is, if in working with language revival we continue to hold the authority, we actually haven't done anything towards undoing how languages are lost in the first place. So in a sense, the languages are still lost if the authority is still lost.
So, continuing our series of lectures on modernism, we now turn to architecture, and in particular to the work of Frank O. Gehry. Now, I'm not going to go into his career in detail. It is enough to say that early on, he was like other modernist architects. tied to the rectangle, the straight line, and so on. Often their buildings would have this basic shape, and they would just add bits of decoration like splashes of color or pointless balconies. Soon enough, Geary wanted to break away from straight lines and grid-like designs. He wanted the freedom to experiment with other shapes, curves, and unusually angled roofs. What helped him with this was the computer, which allowed him to visualize and experiment with complex shapes and to work on the whole design as one piece, without the added decoration being thrown in as an afterthought. Architecture as art, if you like. Or sculpture even. He himself said that he had struggled with crossing the line between architecture and sculpture. Now, I want to talk about one building in particular, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which I think you'll agree is a masterpiece.
This is an example of biomedical engineering. And so this is one picture that probably you all know what it is when you see it. It's a familiar looking image. It's something that probably we all have some personal experience with, right? This is a chest x-ray that would be taken in your doctor's office, for example, or a radiologist's office. And it is a good example of biomedical engineering in that it takes a physical principle, that is, how do x-rays interact with the tissues of your body, and it uses that physics, that physical principle, to develop a picture of what's inside your body. So to look inside and see things that you couldn't see without this device. And you'll recognize some of the parts of the image. You can see the rib cage here, the bones. You can see the heart is this large, bright object down here. If you're have good eyesight from the distance that you're at, you can see the vessels leading out of the heart and into the lungs, and the lungs are these darker spaces within the rib cage.
In the Western countries, women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rate increased during the earliest 20th century, but it started to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as an example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to its lowest point that has never been seen in the society. It also has impacts on male in the society, especially young men, and it might have some connection with the unemployment rates as well.
Take the coffee industry. The figures are roughly these. The coffee market in the world is worth about 60 billion. The growers get about 5.5 billion. 10 years ago, the market was about 30 billion, and the growers got a third of that. What has happened? What has happened is that well-meaning people, Americans, Germans, Europeans, decided that they would help Vietnam. And so, they created a coffee industry there, which is now the second biggest producer in the world. This has had serious effects on other countries like Colombia that depend on coffee exports.
The shuttle was designed to be a space truck. It's a multi-purpose vehicle. We've done a tremendous number of different things with it. It's the most versatile space vehicle that has ever been built. We've used it to launch satellites. We've used it to repair satellites in orbit and put them back into orbit. We've used it to capture satellites and bring them back to Earth for repair. We've outfitted it with the Space Lab built by our European partners and used it before the era of the space station to do scientific research. We used it as part of our partnership with the Russians, which is still continuing, first as part of the Mir space station, where we actually prolonged the useful life of Mir by several years through logistical supply visits with the shuttle. And now, of course, we're using it to build the new International Space Station, which is a huge international partnership.
The comics I show you with lots of people chatting around in a room is a form of description. We use different kinds of methods to describe a situation. Sometimes we have to use visual description, particularly when we do not witness a scenario. I was born during the Second World War, and my hometown is X. For example, when I asked my mother about the war, I always ask her, "You have mentioned this or that when you talked to me when you asked her about the shelter. I asked her what the shelter looks like and when did you go to the shelter." From her response, I could get more visual evidence as I can to write my book.
The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant, but it gets worse when you listen up close.
It does for most people, but for me, it actually just makes me excited.
Omar Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech.
I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab.
Enon's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus.
If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore, but I would also sometimes feel that I would feel this basically catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee.
A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees to eavesdrop as their legs bend?
What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other during those movements.
He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic and more irregular in an injured knee than in a healthy one, which Inan says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery.
In 1943, what became known as the Green Revolution began when Mexico, unable to feed its growing population, shouted for help. Within a few years, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations founded the International Rice Research Institute in Asia, and by 1962, a new strain of rice called IR8 was feeding people all over the world. IR8 was the first really big modified crop to make a real impact on world hunger. In 1962, the technology did not yet exist to directly manipulate the genes of plants, and so IR8 was created by carefully crossing existing varieties, selecting the best from each generation, further modifying them, and finally finding the best. Here is the power of modified crops. IR8, with no fertilizer, straight out of the box, produced 5 times the yield of traditional rice varieties. In optimal conditions with nitrogen, it produced 10 times the yield of traditional varieties. By 1980, IR36 resisted pests and grew fast enough to allow 2 crops a year instead of just 1, doubling the yield. And by 1990, using more advanced genetic manipulation techniques, IR72 was outperforming even IR36. The Green Revolution saw worldwide crop yields explode from 1960 through 2000.
Some adverse effects of climate changes change agricultural production. Some lands are just merely unsuitable for growing crops. There will be millions of people facing hunger in Africa in the near future. Climate change will result in less production and less food. It is difficult for developing countries to deal with climate change due to their financial status and other issues. There are many people living in hunger, especially in Africa. The climate change has devastating effects on world economy. The tropical areas on Earth are dry and hot, and are originally not suitable for food production. The change of climate leads to extreme weather conditions such as floods and hurricanes, which exacerbates the food production issues. As a result, it leads to a continuous decline in food supply annually, around 10 to 17%. And this trend is perceived to be continuing in the future. By 2017, the region suffering the most will be some African countries. Australia's location is important for the world's export, and its international trade is also very important. Since Australia has a large territory with vast, uninhabitable areas, all towns are scattered around. This leads to huge expenses for transportation when using trains and ferries. The government also have to pay large amounts for its telecommunications to build up the connection between these regions. The Australian people are mainly living in 5 cities: Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide. The most special one is Perth, which is one of the most isolated cities in the world. However, this does not affect its state to be one of the largest cities in Australia. Most large companies, like the 2 leading companies, Telstra and Qantas, they are both based in Perth.
With over 40 years unrivaled experience and a worldwide reputation, BSI leads the way in testing and certification of fire safety products. Based in our dedicated labs in Hemel Hempstead, Our team provides BSI kite mark and CE testing and certification for a broad range of products including fire extinguishers, hoses, alarm panels and heat and smoke detectors. We help clients to gain access into the European market by ensuring that products meet all the CE mark requirements. And we're familiar with the market access regulations of most countries across the world, enabling customers to enter markets globally. The BSI kite mark is categorised as a British super brand and acknowledged the world over as a symbol of trust, integrity and quality. It provides the reassurance that vital product safety and performance requirements have been met. Our team subjects each product to a rigorous set of tests, along with robust production control audits, designed specifically to ensure that they perform to required standards of safety and quality. We test for compatibility of fire detection and fire alarm system components to ensure that they're compatible and connectable. This service meets the growing requirement of European regulatory authorities to meet national installation guidelines. We also perform tests on individual detection components. Fire suppression products, such as fire extinguishers, are subjected to rigorous tests designed to ensure that they're effective, safe, and capable of performing in the environments and conditions in which they're stored and used. The symbols for BSI kite mark and CE certification represent quality, safety and trust. For specifiers, they demonstrate a commitment to best practice procurement, and for the public, they provide the reassurance that fire safety products are effective and reliable.
This simulation shows what you might see if you were orbiting a black hole. The light and position of background stars around the hole are distorted by its gravity, and they seem to spin around. On the right, the constellation Orion appears to approach the event horizon, the boundary from which nothing can escape. Orion's stars look like they become separated and get spun around. Once the hole has passed by, Orion reappears on the left and looks normal again. Users can also experiment with different scenarios. This is what you might see if you were travelling towards a black hole, with rocket engines slowing your descent. Another simulation mimics freefall into a hole. In the middle, the light of the entire universe appears to be concentrated in a bright ring.
Now, for better or worse, we live in a world profoundly affected by Sigmund Freud. If I had to ask you, name a famous psychologist, the answer, most of you, would be Freud. He's the most famous psychologist ever, and he's had a profound influence on the 20th and 21st century. Some biographical information: he was born in the 1850s. He spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria, but he died in London, and he escaped to London soon after retreating there at the beginning of World War II, as the Nazis began to occupy where he lived. He's one of the most famous scholars ever, but he's not known for any single discovery. Instead, he's known for the development of an encompassing theory of mind, one that he developed over the span of many decades. He was, in his time, extremely well known, a celebrity, recognized on the street. And throughout his life, he was a man of extraordinary energy and productivity, in part because he was a very serious cocaine addict, but also just in general, he was just a high-energy sort of person.
Thanks for this opportunity to speak about Australia's engagement with Asia from the perspective of trade, and in particular to say a few words about what Austrade is doing in this space. I'm particularly pleased to be addressing trade and investment, not just, of course, because these two things are inextricably linked, but also, of course, because Austrade reports to Australia's first ever Minister for Trade and Investment. Asia's importance to Australia's economy is growing by the day. It is one of the most important factors to consider when assessing the international conditions for our national prosperity. Asian demand for our exports has helped Australia manage the global financial crisis better than most other developed economies, in fact, probably better than all other developed economies. And investment from Asia has added to the productive capacity of the economy and to overall productivity. In 2013, 7 of our top 10 export markets were in Asia and represented 65% of our total exports. Asian markets and Australia's geographic proximity are critical, not just for our trade ties and our capacity to access important global supply chains, but also to the level of foreign investment in Australia. FDI has grown markedly in Australia over the past decade. In fact, it has more than doubled from about $292 billion to $630 billion in 2013.
All my research and that I conducted with my 60+ graduate students was motivated by the need to learn so that we can teach. Of course, some inventions happened along the way, but I have always considered that the end result, I always considered these inventions to be byproducts of the learning process. The end product for me was always better understanding, or when one really succeeded, a unifying theory that can help us in teaching the subject. I have also looked at teaching as a vehicle to try new ideas or new ways of doing things on an intelligent group of learners. That is, as a vehicle for teaching research results. In my experience, this kind of teaching is the most stimulating and motivating to students. I have also uncovered many interesting research problems in the course of teaching a subject. It is this unity of research and teaching, their close connection, and the benefits garnered by exercising their interplay that to me characterizes the successful professor.
Computer scientist Shwetak Patel and his team are developing new sensing systems.
The initial focus was really around energy and water monitoring.
They built a new generation of smart sensors that monitor electronic interference on a home's power line or water pressure changes in the plumbing. Most of this technology has already found industrial applications, and Patel and his team turned their attention to adapting the technology for personal health monitoring.
So how do we take this noise and make it into a signal of interest was kind of the core of what we did for many years, and we're taking that work and applying it to other domains.
They're looking to take advantage of all the functionality built into our smartphones. With the user's permission, this app can use the microphone built into most smartphones to listen to background noises, such as coughing, searching for patterns that suggest a trip to the doctor might be in order.
We construct these models that try and understand how sound works, how what its patterns are, and we give it a whole bunch of examples of different kinds of audio, things like people talking, things like people laughing, sneezing, and of course coughing.
This app uses a phone's camera to check hemoglobin levels in blood by analyzing the color of capillary fluids through the skin.
Generally, what happens is if you're anemic, your blood's going to be a little less red. And we take advantage of that by putting your finger over a camera of a phone. The camera of the phone can actually see the coloration of the blood.
And this test uses the camera to help parents worried about jaundice in newborn infants.
Now, jaundice is something that doctors who have seen tons of babies can just kind of figure out on a very basic level of, is this baby, do they need to get treatment, or are they in a good condition? Whereas a first-time parent has no idea necessarily what jaundice might look like.
The researchers say the built-in sensors found in smartphones are already commonplace, but their applications and their implications for our health and well-being may be more far-reaching than we ever imagined.
The Earth's temperature is rising, and as it does, springtime phenomena, like the first bloom of flowers, are getting earlier and earlier. But rising temperatures aren't the only factor. Urban light pollution is also quickening the coming of spring.
So temperature and light are really contributing to a double whammy of making everything earlier.
Richard French-Constant, an entomologist at the University of Exeter. He and his colleagues compiled 13 years of data from citizen scientists in the UK who tracked the first bud burst of 4 common trees. And it turns out light pollution from street lights in cities and along roads pushed bud burst a full week earlier, way beyond what rising temperatures could achieve. This disruptive timing can ripple through the ecosystem.
The caterpillars that feed on trees are trying to match the hatching of their eggs to the timing of bud bursts, because the caterpillars want to feed on the juiciest and least chemically protected leaves. And it's not just the caterpillars, of course, that are important, but the knock-on effect is on nesting birds, which are also trying to hatch their chicks at the same time that there's the maximum number of caterpillars.
So earlier buds could ultimately affect the survival of birds and beyond.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, finished, that had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labour, and that is their primary purpose in society.
Joseph Lister was an English surgeon who was the first man to realise the importance of aseptic techniques during surgical procedures. Lister was born in Essex, England, and after obtaining a Bachelor of Arts degree from University College London, he qualified as a doctor in 1852. Lister became assistant surgeon at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and was later made surgeon at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary in Scotland. The accepted belief at the time was that contact of an open wound with moisture in the air caused infection, so surgical wounds were covered after operating with non-sterile cloths, which increased the risk of infection. Lister refused to accept this theory, and after reading the works of Louis Pasteur, he tried to prevent bacterial infection of surgical wounds by applying pure carbolic acid to surgical dressings, as well as cleaning wounds with the acid during and after surgery. Lister studied the effects of his treatment for 2 years and then published his findings. This led to the adoption of doctors wearing white gowns, which were used to show dirt, and using surgical gauze and carbolic acid to clean wounds after surgery. Lister successfully treated Queen Victoria using his new methods, and he was appointed chairman of clinical surgery at King's College Hospital, London, where he continued his research into antiseptics and clean surgery until he retired in 1893, and died in Kent, England, aged 85.
A non-governmental organization is an organization that is neither a part of a government nor a conventional for-profit business. Usually set up by ordinary citizens, NGOs may be funded by governments, foundations or businesses. Some avoid formal funding altogether and are run primarily by volunteers. NGOs are highly diverse groups of organizations engaged in a wide range of activities, and take different forms in different parts of the world. Some may have charitable status, while others may be registered for tax exemption based on recognition of social purposes. Others may be funds for political, religious or other interest groups. The number of NGOs operating in the United States is estimated at 1.5 million. Russia has 277,000 NGOs. India is estimated to have had around 2 million NGOs in 2009, just over 1 NGO per 600 Indians, and many times the number of primary schools and primary health centers in India. NGOs are difficult to define, and the term NGO is not used consistently. As a result, there are many different classifications in use. The most common focus is on orientation and level of operation. An NGO's orientation refers to the type of activities it takes on. These activities might include human rights, environmental, or development work. An NGO's level of operation indicates the scale at which an organization works, such as local, regional, national or international.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
So the way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching, and archback nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming, and the rats that do very little, but most rats are in between. So that resembles human behavior as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you do, you observe them and you put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring, and the low lickers in another cage. And then you let them grow, and they're adults now. Their mothers are long buried. And you look in the brain and you see that those who had high licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those who are low lickers express very little. That reflects in the number of receptors. And that results in a different stress response. But this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get a mutation, a polymorphism once in a million, here just the motherly love changes hundreds of genes in one shot. And it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also say it by behavior. So if you walk to the cages, to the room, the rats that were poorly licked are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive. And the rats that were very well handled as little pups, they are much more relaxed, much easier to handle. So, like every technician in the lab knows, looking at the adult rat, how it was licked when it was a little pup. And the question, of course, is mechanism. How does this work?
Now, the economists calculated it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation that removing all immigration controls would double the size of the world economy, and even a small relaxation of immigration controls would lead to disproportionately big gains. Now, for an ethical point of view, it's hard to argue against a policy that will do so much to help people that are much poorer than ourselves. The famous RAND study reckons that a typical immigrant who arrives in US ends up with $20,000 a year. That's rough. It's not just the migrants themselves who gain. It's the countries they come from. Already the migrants working for poor countries, working in rich countries, send home around $200 billion a year through formal channels, and about twice as that through informal channels. And that compares to the neat $100 million that Western governments give in aid. These remittances are not wasted on weapons or siphoned off into Swiss bank accounts. They go straight into the pockets of local people. They pay for food, clean water, and medicines. They help kids in school. They help start up new business.
Increasing combustion, which leads to greenhouse gas emission, is the major cause of global warming and climate change. Moreover, soot is also another big threat to human health, which is produced by incomplete combustion of fossil fuel and biomass. It is said that soot emission is 1/4 more harmful to health than carbon dioxide is. It is not to say that we should ignore carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases. The reduction of soot emission is the quickest and most economical way to tackle global warming in short term. Therefore, global warming efforts should focus on reducing soot particles in order to slow global warming.
In 1906 in New York City, the Warren family got sick with a disease called typhoid fever. Typhoid fever was a scary disease without a cure. First, a person would feel tired and feverish, and then they would have muscle aches, weight loss, rash, and a swollen abdomen. Quite often, typhoid fever would lead to death. A government worker came to the Warren home to investigate and see where the typhoid fever could have come from. As the worker investigated, he took notice of the cook, Mary Mullen. Mullen had worked as a cook for many families in the early 1900s, and each of them had contracted typhoid fever. It was soon realized that Mary Mullen was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever. That meant that she had the disease all the time, but she never felt any symptoms of it. She was spreading the disease without even knowing it. Mullen was given the nickname Typhoid Mary. Doctors and scientists were very intrigued by Mullen and wanted to examine her, but she would always refuse. There was even an instance that she chased away doctors with a carving fork. Eventually, she was arrested and sent to a prison.
I believe our borders should be open, but if that is not politically acceptable for now, Europe should at least open up a legal route for people from developing countries to come work here. Over time, hopefully, we can move to a position where borders are completely open. Persuading skeptics won't be easy. That's why I think the argument for free migration has to be made at several levels, a principled case. It increases freedom and reduces injustice. A humanitarian case. It helps people much poorer than ourselves. An economic case. It makes us richer. And a pragmatic case. It is inevitable, so it is in everyone's interest to make the best of it. Freedom of movement is not just a matter of human rights and international solidarity. It is in our self-interest. Opening our borders may seem unrealistic, but so too once did abolishing slavery or giving women the vote. Campaigning for people's right to move freely is a noble cause of our time.
Recent studies have also found a link between obesity and variations in the bacteria species that live in our digestive systems. No matter the cause, obesity is an escalating global epidemic. It substantially raises the probability of diseases like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, and cancer. It affects virtually all ages, genders, and socioeconomic groups in both developed and developing countries. With a 60% rise in child obesity globally over just 2 decades, the problem is too significant to ignore. Once a person is obese, the climb to recovery becomes progressively steeper. Hormonal and metabolic changes reduce the body's response to overeating. After losing weight, a formerly overweight person burns less calories doing the same exercises as a person who is naturally the same weight, making it much more difficult to shed the excess fat. And as people gain weight, damage to signaling pathways makes it increasingly difficult for the brain to measure food intake and fat storage. There is, however, some evidence that well-monitored, long-term changes in behavior can lead to improvements in obesity-related health issues. And weight loss from sustained lifestyle changes or invasive treatments like bariatric surgery can improve insulin resistance and decrease inflammation.
Only one country, tiny little Bhutan, wedged between China and India, has adopted the gross national happiness as the central index of government policy, and actually has had a good deal of success in education and in health and in economic growth and in environmental preservation, and they have a rather sophisticated way of measuring the effects of different policies on people's happiness. But they're the only country to go that far. But you're now beginning to get other countries interested enough to do kind of white paper policy analyses about whether happiness research, what effects would it have if we used it more for public policy. You're beginning to get countries like Australia, France, Great Britain that are considering publishing regular statistics on happiness. So it's beginning to become a subject of greater interest for policymakers and legislators in different advanced countries.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
Infinite monkey theory. The infinite monkey theorem states that a monkey hitting keys at random on a typewriter keyboard for an infinite amount of time will almost surely type a given text, such as the complete works of William Shakespeare. In this context, almost surely is a mathematical term with a precise meaning, and the monkey isn't actually a monkey, but a metaphor for an abstract device that produces a random sequence of letters ad infinitum. So, the theorem illustrates the perils of reasoning about infinity by imagining a vast but finite number, and vice versa. The probability of a monkey exactly typing a complete work such as Shakespeare's Hamlet is so tiny that the chance of it occurring during a period of time of the order of the age of the universe is minuscule, but not zero. But technologies can help monkeys to write. If the monkeys are given a pen and some papers to spell the word monkey, they can only scratch it on the paper. By contrast, though, if they were given a typewriter, it will take them over 10 years to produce the right spelling. However, if they can use computer programming, they can finish a task within a day, maybe.
Cities are interesting places. Some cities are carefully planned, built for a reason, and reflect the needs of the people as it grows. Others are less conscientiously designed. Paris, for example, was originally founded in the 3rd century as a small village, and with every passing generation it grew in size and importance. It grew from a medieval city to a modern city, but the transition was not always smooth. By the 1800s, the population of Paris had grown so much that the small, medieval streets were crammed tight with people, the markets were overcrowded, and the sewage system, well, let's just say it was inadequate. So Paris needed a makeover. But they couldn't just apply for one of those home renovation TV shows we all love so much. So Emperor Napoleon III had to hire someone to oversee the rebuilding of Paris. The man he chose was Georges Eugene Haussmann.
NASA has just released a new image captured by the Hubble Space Telescope, revealing what it looked like moments before galactic clusters, cosmic clusters that consist of many galaxies held together by gravity smashed into each other. The result of this cosmic collision of galaxy clusters was the formation of a new massive structure called MAX J0416.1 2403, or simply MAX J0416, that lies roughly 4.3 billion light-years from Earth in the constellation Eridanus. Pictures of galactic clusters sometimes don't look real, because every single one of the tiny, stereotypically spiral disks in the image above looks an awful lot like they were just photoshopped haphazardly onto a black background. But these images are completely real and also incredible, because each one of those galaxies contains billions of stars and countless planets, just like our own Milky Way contains the planets and the stars of our solar system. To create the image above, which the team is calling the Cosmic Kaleidoscope, researchers combined data captured by 3 different telescopes set to capture individual parts of the sky. As the team explains, the image of the cluster combines data from 3 different telescopes, the NASA/ESA Hubble Space Telescope showing the galaxy and stars, the NASA Chandra X-ray Observatory diffuse emission in blue, and the NRAO Jansky Very Large Array diffuse emission in pink. Each telescope shows a different element of the cluster, allowing astronomers to study MAX J0416 in detail.
The basis of all life on Earth is the cell. All creatures on Earth are made up of cells. I'm not going to dwell on the biology of cells much. It's not that relevant, but I do want to point out a few things. First of all, there are two sorts of cells. There's something called the prokaryotic cell, which is fairly simple, and it's the thing that all bacteria are made of. And then we have a eukaryotic cell, a much more complicated beast on the right, which didn't appear until well into the history of the biosphere on Earth. And there are many single-celled eukaryotes, but there are also, and importantly, multicellular organisms, and all of those are based on the eukaryotic cell.